Hong Kong's next executive election has one candidate.
Hong Kong's election has now become a sham.
And the communist regime continues to crack down on the ever-shrinking list of freedom.
The aspirations for those students in Tiananmen Square in '89 is worth more than the short-term comfort and prosperity.
Why do Hong Kongers continue to resist?
Because once people have tasted freedom, you can't tell them to forget it.
Today, I speak with Samuel Chu, a Hong Kong American activist and founder of Campaign for Hong Kong. We discuss the upcoming election in the city, the Hong Kong democracy movement, and the Communist Party's goal to kill freedom, as well as his personal journey defending the rights from Beijing. Samuel Chu, thank you so much for joining us today here on China Insider.
Thank you for having me, David.
You're now quote-unquote hunted by the national security law. Tell us the experience that you always tell other people about what has happened after the passing of the law.
So I remember, I think, when the national security law was first proposed, and I think it's important to remember that the Hong Kong or the Beijing government did not actually reveal what was in the national security law until they implemented it. So it went into effect before we all found out what was in it. And I do remember when it was first revealed, I read through the text, and there was this one section called Article 38, where it specifically states that it doesn't matter if you are physically in Hong Kong or in China, doesn't matter if you are a resident of Hong Kong or China, that everything in the national security law could apply to you. And I remember having sort of a semi-joke moment with our legal counsel and a few of our other colleagues, saying that I think they wrote that for us right here in the US, for those of us who were working overseas. And little did I know that a month later, I woke up one morning and there was in the headlines in Hong Kong in the pro-Beijing newspapers that I was one of 6 people who were wanted under the national security law. And I became the first foreign citizen to be targeted.
So you're saying pretty much anybody in the world that, from what I understand about the law, is if you do criticize or quote-unquote threaten the national security of Hong Kong, no matter if you're American or Korean or Japanese, you could technically be charged under that law. Correct.
And I think that by targeting me, they have confirmed what we've been arguing, in the last few years, which is that this repression does not stop at the border. It is not just in Hong Kong. It is not just happening in the mainland, but it actually extends to the doorsteps of everyone here in the United States and across the world.
What do you feel it must feel weird to be charged by something that, a regime that in its nature is a dictator, it's an authoritarian government. But at the same time, this is actually real life. This is something that's happening to you.
In some way, I always felt like that I was fortunate because I have chosen to do this work. I think about the 7.5 million Hong Kongers and millions of Uyghurs, minorities, and Tibetans and others in the mainland who didn't get a choice and are now living under this oppressive regime and have lost their freedom. I look at my situation as American citizen on American soil, lobbying and advocating my own government in America. I think what they have done is to really reveal and show their cards that this is nothing about national security. This is about censorship. It is about intimidation. And this is about exporting what they're doing to its own citizens internationally.
What does it tell you that Hong Kong's next election has only one candidate, Li Ka-chiu, and why?
Well, I don't think that there's this is any shock to anybody that Hong Kong's election has now become a sham. We saw this during the electoral elections last year, where essentially the whole opposition political body politic was purged completely under this new framework of the patriot govern, only concept, instead of the even semi-democratic election that was open for the LegCo, for the Legislative Council. I think that this is an inevitable development, right? That you have essentially the former police official, security chief, that has been elevated in an environment where the national security law essentially trumps everything else in the city. And it is a natural evolution that they would not only securize the law, the courts, but to elevate a security official to be the enforcer. And I think that, it's interesting and important to note that no chief executive has made it past more than one term since the handover in Hong Kong. And part of that devolution, I would call it, is sort of devolving into this recognition that that is actually not a sustainable or meaningful role in any shape or form. I think that when it was first elected or selected in the beginning, I think that there's potential for that position to reflect the opinions and wishes of Hong Kongers as a go-between, as someone who can advocate for Hong Kong people in the framework of one country, two system. But what we've seen in the last few years is that there is no interest whatsoever on the part of the Hong Kong government in the current Carrie Lam regime, or really anybody, to reflect any of the interests of Hong Kongers. And so that position really essentially is just an enforcer for the Beijing regime. And at this point, national security law is the chief executive, and that functions as the supreme law in the city of Hong Kong.
Why do you think Beijing wanted to change Carrie Lam to now Li as the next in power in Hong Kong?
Well, I think that there's been unverified reports, throughout the last few years during Carrie Lam's term, that she herself has tried to quit and have looked for ways to essentially sort of step down and step back. And I think that there is increasing recognition that there's no reason to hide anymore in terms of Beijing's intention, right? Hong Kong has already fallen at this moment. It is in a situation, in a environment where free speech is outlawed, free press has been destroyed, any kind of democratic aspirations as far as in the Legislative Council or District Council or in the chief executive election has been purged. And so I think that I believe Beijing see this as just a natural succession of having, we see this in the mainland, right? We see official being appointed to regions to essentially crack down on any dissent. That's really the criteria they're looking for, is that whoever has the most strongest, tactic and strong-arm people into silence is the most ideal representative for the party, particularly in places where Beijing deem as being problematic.